The flatlanders need a store to sell their gems and more. They need it really quick, Angular will do the trick. Directives set the stage in your HTML page. Controllers give your app the behavior that it lacks. Write expressions so that you can add your data to the view. And modules make connections with dependency injections. You're a scripting connoisseur when shaping up with Angular JS.
You're watching Shaping Up with Angular, and this is level 4, where we're going to be talking about using ng-include and creating our own custom directives. Jumping back into our existing code, we have this snippet of HTML where we print out the product name and the product price. If there were multiple places in our application, and let's assume there are, where we reuse this identical piece of code, we may want to eliminate that duplication by pulling it out into an HTML snippet. To do this, first we'll pull out that duplicate code into a new file that we'll name product-title.html. Then inside of our index.html, we'll use the ng-include directive, specifying the name of the file we want to include. You'll notice here that we're using double quotes and single quotes. That's because ng-include is expecting a variable with the name of the file. If we want to pass a name directly as a string, we've got to use the single quotes inside of the double quotes. Once this file is included, you'll see the generated HTML look something like this. So if we jump into our browser, we can see here that nothing's changed, but the way that our page is loading is slightly different. When our browser does a web request, it can only pull down one HTML file. That's going to be the index. It's going to pull that down, and it's going to load everything up, and then when it gets to that ng-include, it gives it the name of a file, or even a URL, and it's actually going to be doing an AJAX request back to the server to pull down the contents of that file and load it into the page. Using ng-include works, but there's a preferable way when we want to include a template, and that's by using a custom directive. Might look something like this. There's a little more code we have to write behind the scenes to make it work, but this is what it would look like inside your index.html. Why should you write a directive instead? Well, directives are part of the secret sauce of Angular, because they allow you to write HTML that expresses behavior of your application. Typically, HTML only tells you about the structure. It doesn't tell you what your application does. But if you look at a typical Angular application like this one, even though you've never seen this application before, or even played with it on your browser, I bet you can still understand what it does. So expressiveness is the real power of writing custom directives, and there are several different types of directives you can use. First, there's template expanding directives. Those are the simplest ones. We define a custom tag or attribute, which expands and shows as a template, like an ng-include would. These can also include controller logic. Directives can also be used for expressing complex UIs, calling events, registering event handlers, and reusing common components. But for this course, we're going to stick to the first, most basic way to use a custom directive. To make this product title custom directive work, we need to define this directive from inside our app.js. We'll write app.directive, specify product title, and the second argument is going to be an anonymous function, which returns a directive definition object. This is basically a configuration defining how your directive is going to work. You might also have noticed here that the dash in the HTML of the directive will translate to camel case in JavaScript when we define the directive. We'll want to declare two configuration options for this directive. The first is restrict E. This is where we specify the type of directive. In this case, E stands for element, since we're declaring a new HTML element. Then we'll specify the URL of a template we want this directive to load into the page. In this case, just product-title.html. Then, when we use this directive, it'll simply render out the template into our index.html. Now if we jump into the web page, it should look the same, which it does, but this time it's using the directive, and our HTML is more expressive. Directives in Angular can either be elements, like you see here, and notice we're not using a self-closing tag. You might be wondering about that. We don't want to use a self-closing tag because some browsers don't like self-closing tags when using custom elements. So that's why we're not using one. If we wanted to write this directive as an attribute directive, it might look like this, where we specify product title as an attribute inside an H3 element. It's best practice to use an element directive when you're doing things like UI widgets and attribute style directives when you have things like mix-ins which add behaviors to HTML, like maybe a tooltip. If we wanted to use a directive attribute instead, our definition would look slightly different. We'd specify restrict A, because in this case, A stands for attribute, and then we could properly use an attribute directive. When you pick up the source for somebody's web application, do you think you could understand the behavior of the application just by reading the HTML? Typically not. This is why Angular is so awesome. It allows you to write expressive HTML through custom directives so that people can read your HTML and understand the behavior and intent of your application. Time for you to write your first custom directives. I hope you're excited, and I'll see you in the next section.